The AI for Good Global Summit, convened by ITU, recognizes the joint responsibility of governments, the private sector, United Nations agencies, academia, and others to ensure AI reaches its full potential while preventing and mitigating harms.
And it's a moment that calls for action. And today I'm calling on each of you to use this summit to help the world to better understand what kinds of regulations, what kinds of guardrails we need to put in place right now. So together, let's make it innovative, let's make it safe, and let's make it responsible for all. Thank you very much.
Welcome to AI for Good, the leading action-oriented, global and inclusive United Nations platform on AI. Organized by ITU, in partnership with 40 UN sister organizations, and co-convened with Switzerland. The goal of AI for Good is to identify practical applications of AI to advance the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and scale those solutions for global impact. In today's session, we're counting on you to use the live video wall feature to ask questions and post comments to help create an engaging discussion. We encourage you to stay until the end to chat, connect, ask questions, and network with our distinguished panelists and world-class AI experts in the neural network. It is now time to kick off the session and welcome our first speaker. The floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to AI for Good. I am Reinhard Scholl from the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union. In the field of AI, there is arguably no other topic that is more discussed than what the impact of AI will mean for our jobs and the jobs of our children. One side argues that history has shown that technological change in the end always worked out for the better of humanity, with new jobs being created, better jobs being created thanks to new technologies. And this time around, it will be no different. The other side, however, argues that this time things will be different, and not only because AI will make some of the current jobs obsolete, but the new jobs that are going to be created are also going to be taken over by AI and robots. At AI for Good, we would like to shine light on these debates with talks about the latest studies and research on AI and work. So I'm very happy to announce a new series on AI for Good, namely AI and Work. This series is being curated by two colleagues at the International Labour Organization, ILO. The first talk in this series is actually given today by our two curators of the series, Janine Berg and Pavel Gmirek. Both Janine and Pavel are economists. Janine is a senior economist at the International Labour Organization, and Pavel is a senior researcher at the International Labour Organization. Both know a lot about labor markets, labor relations, working conditions, and the impact of technology on the workforce. They published recently a scientific study on the impact of generative AI on jobs, the results of which they're going to explain today. So today's talk is roughly 30-ish minutes, and so there is ample time for discussion. And so please feel free to put your questions in the chat as we progress in the session. So thank you very much, Janine and Pavel, for curating the series and for kicking it off today. And the floor is now all yours.
Good afternoon, and thank you for this introduction, Reinhard. It is a real pleasure to be here and to present our study as a kickoff session. I will start and Janine will take over. We have a joint presentation. And let me just start by sharing the screen and just go straight to it. So this is an example of a study that tries to explain what is the potential impact of generative AI on jobs, a study that we published last year, as Reinhard mentioned, and that deals with a global picture, a potential global picture, which is not an easy thing to do. So essentially, when one thinks about the ways to model potential impact of a technology, typically there are two broad approaches to it. One can look at occupations and tasks and skills that make up those occupations and understand the impact on the occupations themselves. Or the other approach, often what it does, it tries to look at demand and adoption of technologies, for example, by scanning job ads and trying to use it as a proxy for adoption. So we are using that first approach, which is we try to look at occupations and tasks and try to understand how generative AI might affect those tasks and therefore the occupations. And the first thing to think about is the actual interaction of a technology with tasks. So here you can see three different occupations that had come to interaction with technology in the past. And we can use them to illustrate three different types of thinking about that interaction. On the left, you can see switchboard operators, an occupation that used to be very prominent in the past. And then at some point when a technology appeared, it interacted so strongly with the task that was central to this occupation that basically the occupation no longer exists today. In the middle, you can see a bank teller, and basically this is an occupation that in the 90s seemed to be under threat when connectivity and ATM technologies came in. Many people feared that this would eliminate the bank tellers, who at the time were largely dealing with banknotes and receiving banknotes until that time, and with physical money. And what happened was actually the opposite, as studies from James Besson and other economists have shown. At the time, it created more demand for these jobs. It's just that the job evolved. So that interaction with tasks actually resulted in the evolution of the occupation rather than its elimination. And then on the top right, you have airplane pilots, which is an example of a job where technology comes into interaction with it in a way that you could maybe think of automating the occupation altogether. But even if you were able to do that, probably that's not something you want to do. And you really want to keep that human in the loop for many different reasons. So this is the way we think about it when we study tasks. And this is a slide probably I should call "All Roads Lead to ISCO," because whoever studies occupations and employment eventually comes to that system. If you want to know how many jobs exist in the world, the ISCO is an international standard classification of occupations that is hosted at the ILO and agreed by statisticians internationally. And it's a system of aggregating data from national labor surveys into an international standard so we can make comparisons. So when you actually look deeper into different studies that exist, at one point, they always come to these employment numbers, and so do we. But we also start from this point. So this is the matrix that explains this hierarchical structure of ISCO. You can see at the highest level here on the left, you have 10 groups, 10 broad occupational groups. And at the most detailed level, there are 436 occupations in ISCO, occupational groups. And it turns out that the statisticians during the meetings here, when they set the standards, they also, when they agreed the documentation, the description of each of these occupations, they also agreed on a set of typical tasks. There are 3,123 such tasks in the official ISCO documentation. And basically, they represent what a given occupation is about. And I'll show you in a moment what that means when you start decomposing that. So that's our starting point. And then the second thing that's probably worth mentioning at the outset, on which we also often get questions, and I'm sure we will get some questions here, is the fact that we also use AI tools to sort of power the starting point of this study. So not only do we study it, the impact of generative AI, but also we try to apply it as a tool, as a research tool. And the first thing we used GPT-4 model. We worked through the API of that model at the time. It was the most advanced model. And you can see here on the top the type of Python script that goes into it. And at the bottom, you can see the definition. So the first thing we did is we tried to understand to what this model was trained on different structures beyond ISCO. There is ONET structure, there's ESCO, the European classification of occupations. And we try to understand how well does the model understand occupations. So what we do here, you can see this is the definition in ISCO of a primary school teacher's job. And here on the right, we can see what we can predict using GPT-4. And that definition is not only more longer, but it's also more complete. It kind of makes sense. So we can see that the model is able to also extrapolate from other descriptions and sort of reflect its understanding of what a primary school teacher does. And it does it quite well for many other occupations. The second thing we can look at are tasks. So these are tasks in the ISCO structure. And you can see here on the left, these are official tasks agreed in the job for the job of primary school teacher. And on the right, you can see the tasks that were predicted with GPT-4. And you can see great similarity between those tasks. And that, again, repeats across occupations. What we notice is that when we ask, for example, GPT-4 to generate tasks for an occupation, it tends to generate more digitally related tasks. But that also has to do probably with the fact that ISCO were agreed some time ago, and the model probably picks up on later descriptions from other systems. But in general, it reflects it very well. So the next thing that we do is we take each of those 3,123 tasks and we loop the model over it. And what we do is we basically work with the model. These tools are very good at that, at asking it whether it can perform a given task. So we basically decompose to the finest possible level in this setup of ISCO. And we take each task and say, give us a score between 0 and 1 of whether this can be done with a technology of a similar capacity as GPT-4. And you can see here the scores it will generate. So you have prepared daily lesson plans. And we also, you have a score of 0.6, and we also request the model to produce a written justification why it gave us that score and check for consistency of that. So you can see it tells us it can be helpful in that, but a human teacher's expertise and nuanced understanding is still needed. But it's a fairly high score. When it comes to maintaining discipline and good working habits, it's a very low score. GPT doesn't think that AI of similar capacities can maintain discipline in class. And that's a great thing. But we basically review that later. We have this huge matrix of those scores. And the first thing we do is we take the tasks with the highest scores, above 0.8. And we try to understand, okay, does it make sense? Can we cluster them and see what type of tasks is this telling us it can automate? And you can see here what we did is we converted them into embeddings, and we used a machine learning algorithm to basically cluster them semantically. You can see administration and communication tasks, customer service, providing information, responding to inquiries, processing language and information, and data management and record keeping. So, of course, anyone who had any experience with this latest generation of AI, these conversational models, you can imagine that this is exactly the type of tasks you could imagine them being good at. But the next thing is when we take occupational groups, we can then accrue the tasks and the scores to those groups. And we can see when we take tasks with the highest level of exposure or likelihood of automation and mid-range, and this is basically an arbitrary choice, everything about 0.5 to 0.75 is medium exposure, and everything about 0.75 is high exposure, but that's also based on the distribution we get across all scores. You can see that clerical support workers have about a quarter of tasks that are in high automation exposure range, and then about 60% in the medium. And there's no other occupation that has such a high share of these high exposure scores. But technicians and professionals and service sales workers have quite a large number of tasks within their overall tasks that could be supplemented by this technology and maybe eventually replaced. So the next thing we do is we take all these occupations and we start to examine the distribution. Here's the distribution for managers on the left. So these are probability density plots. And you can see that majority of those tasks for managers are rather low, with only some of them going here into a higher potential automation area. Whereas for clerical support workers, there are occupations where in theory, you could perform most of the tasks in this job with AI of this capability. So as the next thing, we look at that whole distribution again, and we say there are actually two things that matter. The overall score for an occupation that we can calculate based on those task level individual scores, but also the distribution, or standard deviation. So that's the two variables plotted here. On the horizontal, you have a mean score of an occupation. Here you have a standard deviation. And those two moments of distribution help us define how to classify occupations. When we have occupations that have a high overall score and a low standard deviation, that means most of the tasks in there are narrowly grouped around that high score and they contribute to it. So that means those are occupations that are most likely exposed to the risk of automation. And then those blue dots is exactly the opposite. Those are occupations that have a overall score which is below even 0.4. But when you look at the standard deviation and add the two together, they have a lot of tasks in there that have high level scores. So these are occupations that are more likely to be transformed, augmented by replacing some tasks, but there are many tasks that have a low automation potential score. And then you have here in the circle what we call the big unknown. These are occupations that are between those two extremes, and that could go either way, depending on how the technology evolves and how policies around it evolve, including how these technologies are adopted at the workplace. But eventually, this is all good and well, but you want to know how many such jobs exist. And this is what we do here. We go back to ISCO, since we started with it, and we look at employment numbers, and we calculate the share of these occupations in total employment of females and males around the world per income groups and per regions. And you will find more detailed statistics in our paper. Here, what you can see is on top are the jobs with augmentation potential, and you can see that they are fairly evenly distributed across male and female employment. And also they oscillate around, it's around 13%, from 10.4 to 13.4 in high income countries. So there is not that much variation. Where you look at this automation potential, it looks different. First of all, it's lower than augmentation. So the number of jobs that exist today in the world and where you could automate all tasks is way smaller. It's about 2.3%, but it's still 75 million jobs. And you can see that the number of such jobs grows with countries' incomes. So countries in high income group have 5.1%, 30 million such jobs, whereas low income countries have a very small share of such jobs in employment. And you can see a second thing here, those orange bars are always much larger. They're basically 2.5 times larger. And this is women's employment, basically. So female jobs, female held jobs today are more exposed to this risk of automation. So essentially, if you're thinking of your policy options, already this plot gives you an indication. You'd want to avoid the negative part that's here at the bottom and maximize this top part, which could be potentially transformed into additional productivity. And we should highlight here that does not account for new jobs that will be created. We're just looking at the jobs that exist and have been reported. We're looking at the past, jobs that have been reported to us through official statistics from countries. You can also see here, additional 9.1 million jobs exist in that area of big unknown. So that's, 9.1% of total employment, that's 300 million jobs. That's basically that big unknown. So you can use that method for further calculations, and that's essentially a study that we are now working on with the World Bank, with Hernan Winkler, a senior economist there, and the paper will come out later this year. But what you can see here, what we did here is for Latin American countries, we've aggregated the three. So you have this automation potential, augmentation potential, and the big unknown. And this way you come up with sort of the total exposure to AI that can take those three forms. And you come to numbers in the case of Latin American countries from 27% of total employment to 40-something% of total employment. And it's quite, you can then compare it across countries and regions. And there are other papers now coming out that use the same methodology to basically apply it to different regions. And the next thing you can do, and that will be the last slide I will show you, is you can start looking at the characteristics more in depth. So here, what we did in this forthcoming study is we took individual responses in the surveys, in labor force surveys, in those Latin American countries, and based on those, we started looking at who exactly are those people, what is their age, where is their location, what's their education level. And here, I'll just show you this one slide, which is automation potential. So these are those jobs that were red dots in one of the slides I showed earlier, jobs that potentially could be automated because most of the tasks are in that high exposure range. And you can see that there are statistically significant differences. These jobs are more present among women. So as a share of female employment, they're mostly urban jobs. They are jobs held disproportionately by younger people, people with high education, people who are not below the poverty threshold as defined by the World Bank, and they are jobs that generally are held by people that come from higher income settings. We can also see that these are jobs that are more formal jobs in the formal sector, and that this automation risk applies to salaried employees. And we also can disaggregate it by sectors. And you can see here, for example, finance, insurance, and services are the highest. So we basically start looking at more detailed characteristics of those jobs. And what it tells you is, not very good news if that automation was to happen for people in jobs which so far have been formal, good jobs, female-held jobs, and jobs held by younger people and more educated people. So that calls for also policy approaches, and that's where I leave you, and I pass the floor to Janine, who will tell you about our recommendations in that area.
Thanks, Pavel. So as we know from the data that was just shown, most of the jobs are going to be transformed by the technology. And that can be a positive thing, or that could be a negative thing. And it really depends on how the technology is integrated to the workplace. So policy is really important for that aspect. And policy is also very important for the people who will lose their jobs. So even though our numbers don't show a jobs apocalypse, there are nonetheless people who will be affected, and unemployment very much is an individual experience that can be scarring and can have very negative consequences. So it's not something to be minimized, even if the numbers aren't as alarming as has been documented in other studies. So when we think of AI and its integration in the workplace, there's essentially two things that are going on. One is about automating the tasks that workers perform. So in the introductory slide, the switchboard operators who were automated, or now the clerical support workers who have been already facing automation and will face more automation with further advances in AI. The other main use of AI in the workplace is how it's affecting management. So one of the tasks that is being replaced are really the tasks that managers do. So when you think of hiring, for example, or evaluating workers, monitoring to see what type of work they're doing, and even dismissing, if you think of it when you think of platform work, for example, workers in the gig economy, an algorithm can make a decision about blocking them from the platform, which actually could result in essence in dismissal. So all of these things affect workers' experiences at the workplace. So we need to kind of keep those in mind when we're thinking about policy. So turning to the first issue, which is unemployment. If you can go to the next slide, Pavel. Yes. Okay. So the first real area for policy is about how do we how do we protect those workers whose jobs are going to be affected? Now, one approach would be to try to stop technology, but that's not realistic, and that's not something that we're advocating. But there nonetheless can be policies that are put in place, especially if you think of large workplaces. So they might have a group of workers whose jobs can be automated, and those people could be dismissed, but those people ideally would be prioritized for redeployment and training within the organization. And this is something that's in our ILO International Labor Standards, the Employment Protection Convention number 158, which advocates the use of social dialogue in the workplace to move people into other positions as a first step, really, in mitigating some of the negative effects of job loss. But of course, there will be some people that lose their jobs. So skilling policies here are really important. But this is not something that should just be the burden of an individual worker, right? This is really a societal change. These are big technological advances that people haven't, that they can't control. And so it's really necessary to have some sort of collective approach to how we can mitigate this transition, or really manage this transition in a positive way. So here, the need for income support, and then of course the training policies that people can have so that they can do new jobs. It's also important to think about what are the sectors that are growth sectors, and how can we be planning our labor forces, or managing our skill programs and our labor forces so that workers can move into those jobs. One area in particular is the care sector. In healthcare, for example, we know that there's global shortages of doctors, of nurses, of midwives, of elder care workers, of child care workers. This is something that we see across the world. And so as a policy method, one thing would be to invest in these sectors, and ensure that these jobs have decent wages and the benefits and rights that go with decent work, and move people who might be affected into those jobs. Another issue is about the new jobs that will be created. So with all of this new technology, there's always new jobs will be created. It's very hard to anticipate what those jobs are, but with the case of AI, we already know that there's been a lot of jobs that have been created that are training AI systems. So as this was an article in New York Magazine, how many humans does it take to make tech seem human? Millions. So AI is working because people have been laboring and data annotating and making sure that whatever the systems are spewing out is as accurate as possible and not offensive. It's hard to know how many people are doing this kind of work. There was an estimate by the World Bank that 150 million people. It's mainly people in the global South. Some of them are working through business processing outsourcing firms, but a lot of them are just working on online platforms. They're hired as independent contractors, and they don't have the rights and benefits that they would in a regular employment relationship. Many of them have been earning low pay. So this is something where policy can make a difference, turn these jobs that are new jobs that are necessary for AI to function into good quality jobs. And in fact, we'll be having a standard setting discussion at the ILO starting next year on the topic of decent work in the platform economy. So for the jobs that are going to be augmented or transformed, we need to have policies in place that are going to be as beneficial to job quality as possible. And so here we distinguish between three different levels of intervention. One would be really the red lines, the prohibitions that we can't allow happen because they negate workers' fundamental rights. Another area is collective negotiation. And finally, what we're calling workers in the loop, which is, how can we involve workers when technology is integrated into the workplace to make sure that it isn't a detriment to job quality. So starting with red lines, it's necessary to prohibit behavior that infringes upon workers' fundamental rights. So these are rights that are agreed upon by 187 member countries of the ILO. They include the right to freedom of association, the right to anti-discrimination. This is really important. So in a paper that came out just last year by some lawyers at Oxford University, they detail some of the red lines that need to be taken. For example, prohibiting employer monitoring of workers, such as outside of the workplace. Even that could be either temporarily if they're when they're off hours, or geographically if they're in another area. prohibit the monitoring of workers where it poses a risk to human dignity, such as bathrooms, or in private conversations or communications with worker representatives. So we want to avoid a situation where workers who might be thinking of unionizing, for example, and they're having conversations with their coworkers, that the technology is tracking them and then dismissing them because they can see that these people might be forming a trade union, for example. That would be something that would be against their fundamental rights. We want to be also prohibit the algorithmic dismissal of workers. So if you can, yeah. So we want to make sure, for example, that a worker isn't just dismissed, that decision isn't being taken by an algorithm, but rather there is some sort of human that is making that decision, and that there are human mechanisms for redress for those workers. So this is another right that's really important. And another one concerns hiring. We want to put in place audits to make sure that whatever AI is being used for hiring, that it's not unintentionally discriminating workers. And this could happen, for example, if only certain workers receive the job vacancies, or if the algorithm is dismissing workers from, for example, a particular zip code or area in a country where certain minority groups live. Okay, so passing to the next one. The other main area of how to regulate AI's use in the workplace is collective bargaining. And we've seen that collective bargaining in general is a very flexible tool, because rather than just statutory regulation that has, kind of across the board regulation, collective bargaining can really respond to the particular needs of a sector or a particular needs of a firm. So it's much more flexible and it's much quicker. It's much quicker at addressing some of the concerns in AI. It was used, for example, in the recent negotiation with the Screen Actors Guild and in the United States over the use of AI in the movie industry. So collective bargaining can use that regulation, and what we've been seeing lately is the increased use of technological considerations in collective bargaining agreements. But of course, there's still a lot of issues here. A lot of unions and employers organizations that would be at the bargaining table sometimes don't understand the technology. So there is a need for training on this topic. And then, of course, in many countries, we have low levels of unionization, which limit its applicability. And then the next means is really something that's a little bit even more flexible. And that's about really how can you have in workplaces either that are unionized or maybe what we would call high engagement workplaces, to what extent can we have some sort of participatory design so that when the technology is integrated into the workplace, there is a co-design process where workers have a say in how it's being used, the purpose behind it, what safeguards are needed at the firm level. And an understanding really so that the technology doesn't reduce workers' autonomy or discretion. We know from the literature that if workers have less autonomy and they have more pressure, that it's more likely to lead to burnout and mental health. Whereas if there are means for discussion, negotiation, to consult your managers if you have a problem, that can mitigate some of the strains that technology puts on people. And indeed, countries that have stronger traditions of worker consultation, such as the Nordic countries, people are less worried about the effects of technology because of the institutional environment in place. Next slide. So there's other things that we need to be thinking about. So one of the issues that we've been talking about is really how technology can augment productivity, where obviously if it's going to take away some of the routine tasks that I do, and then I have time to do more things and I can become more productive, this is all very beneficial, right, to the world of work. But who's benefiting from these productivity gains? And here's just to illustrate a slide of the productivity and growth and wage growth in the US between in the post-war period, 1948 to 2019. There's been a huge gap between productivity and real wage growth. And this is really attributed to a weakening of labor institutions. So what we need in place when there are productivity gains because of technology, to the extent that these gains can be shared so that we have more equitable outcomes that are beneficial to society. And there, what we really need are stronger labor market institutions. Workers need to have employment security so that they can bargain over the gains. Statutory minimum wages are important. Collective bargaining is important. And we can also be thinking about reducing working time. I mean, there was a huge reduction of working time in the before the First World War and after the Second World War, but since then we haven't been seeing really much reduction in working time. So if people are being made more productive, to what extent could that actually translate into just fewer hours worked rather than more work given to them? And this could also be beneficial in terms of keeping employment levels up. But then the final concern is really about the digital divide. So we know that in many parts of the world, they don't have access to the technology. The picture here is from Latin America. Of course, the situation is more critical in Africa and in parts of Asia, but there's still problems with internet connectivity. There's problems with electricity provision. There's problems with digital skills. So we know that in many countries of the world, there is going to be less of an adoption of the technology, which, maybe at a short run benefit, one could think, well, that will protect jobs, but that's not really the way things work. We want to have countries in the world really benefit from the technology. And so the risk is that it's going to be the richer countries that are able to integrate the technology into their workplace, boosting their productivity, and then increasing the divide, the income divide between rich countries and poor countries. So thank you. That's our presentation.
Thank you very much, Janine and Pavel. We now go to the Q&A, and I invite the audience to pose any questions they would like on the video wall. So you have Pavel and Janine, you have a paper available so people can easily find it. You can look up the Google Scholar and download it from there. You also have all the data, and you all make them publicly available for people who really want to go into the nitty-gritty details. You can just contact Janine and Pavel about the original data. You mentioned, Janine, you had a slide on the digital divide. One piece of statistics that the ITU often cites is that there are a large number of people who are not online yet. And so our latest numbers are 2.6 billion people. That's 37% of the world's populations are not yet online. Okay, so I'm waiting for questions to come in, but until then, let me warm up a bit with some questions of my own. How should the tax system adapt to mitigate the changes that AI and robots or technology in general will have on the workforce?
Yeah, so I mean, taxation is one of the big problems that the world has been facing, particularly because countries and many multinational corporations, and of course in the technology sphere, many of the big companies are multinationals and so aren't necessarily paying as much in taxes as they are in profits. And so this is a problem because it's clear, particularly from our policy recommendations, if we're going to be supporting workers in managing this transition, governments need financing. They need financing for the skilling programs. They need financing to provide income support. Countries in the global south need financing to build the infrastructure necessary to benefit from the technology, and all that relies on taxation. So I think there needs to be a bigger push for addressing the situation of global taxation. There's been there have been some advances within the OECD, but certainly it needs to be a priority in order to finance all of the policies that we're advocating.
I mean, there was some talk maybe a couple of years ago regarding a robot tax. So that what do you think of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the argument there is that in the workplace in particular, labor tends to be taxed, what they say, more than capital, and so we should be taxing capital rather than labor. In general, though, the taxation for labor is actually social security contributions, which we don't really, it's not really a tax, it's a contribution, even though an employer may think of it as a tax. And so we don't want to get rid of social security contributions. We don't want to move to that. But saying that we're going to tax investments in technology, I mean, I personally feel, and this is not an ILO position, I personally feel that that's very difficult to do. How do you distinguish within the technology? How do you set the taxes? I think it's better to have higher corporate taxes and stronger mechanisms for gathering the taxes than just actually trying to target the robots themselves or the AI technology itself.
Mm.
I think that's a more straightforward approach.
Okay. You had yes, Pavel.
Yeah, I mean, Janine also just mentioned that, I mean, there is a discussion among some of economists, one of whom we will interview in the next series here, about the taxation question. But I think what is interesting in those discussions is that notion of how taxes set incentives for complementarity. So one of the arguments is that, you know, in many tax systems currently, you have the system that sort of incentivizes full replacement of labor. But if you think of tax structures as something as an incentive structure, then there is a discussion about setting incentives for complementarity of technology and labor. And that would be sort of the win-win. And I think, you know, there is no one recipe. It's so specific to national context and existing systems. But I think as a guiding principle, it's an interesting thought. You know, what different tax incentives do in terms of encouraging full replacements, full automation, or instead encouraging more complementarity between labor and machines in general. And we have lessons there from schemes that were implemented also during COVID, I think, you know, encouragements to retain workers, to retrain where that could be, you know, used as lessons learned for this particular situation. But again, this is something that is very much context specific and is obviously very different in high income countries. And our study also looks at developing countries very much, and that picture looks there completely differently.
Okay, thank you, Janine and Pavel. Here is a question from our watchers, viewers. So for occupations with more exposure to the impacts of AI, do you see the need to change education and training systems? How can your findings guide career planning, for example?
Yeah. Okay. So one thing with education systems, I think it's important to use the technology. So one of the possible implications of AI is that a lot of the entry-level type jobs that people will be doing, is particularly in the associate professional field, might not be necessary anymore. So for people, if you think of, for example, a lawyer, some of the original due diligence type work that they would be doing when they first join a law firm could be done easily by the technology. So to the extent that education systems can really train workers to use the technology while they're learning about the law in this example, that would be a benefit for then integrating those workers into a law firm where some of the older lawyers don't know how to use the technology. So I think, basically closing your eyes against the technology isn't going to help. So I think we need to be using the technology as much as possible, and that's something that has to be in the curriculum. It's hard to predict, which jobs are going to go away. We have our numbers for clerical workers. Certainly, I think we stand by those, and we think that those are probably areas that people could be thinking more about learning skills that we know are needed. I mentioned in the beginning about the care economy. There's also a lot of jobs that are going to be needing for the green transition. So those are areas where people, but more importantly, really governments need to be investing so that those skills can be developed for the needs of the economies.
Okay, thank you, Janine. Pavel, you would like to add something, or I go to the next question? Okay.
Whatever you prefer.
I'm coming to the to the $1 million question, which young people are asking, but not just young people, also parents. Which jobs should young people go into? So I guess in the Middle Ages, if you were a peasant or a smith or a baker, you knew that your job 50 years down the road would still look very, very much the same. And today it's not, you really know, no one knows what the job market or what the jobs will look like in the years to come. So what is your advice to those who ponder about in which field to go?
Do you want to take that, Pavel? I'm talking more than you are, so you're muted.
Pavel, you're muted. Oh, sorry. I can start, but as Reinhard said, that's $1 million or maybe more dollars question. And I think, well, first of all, it depends what you aim for, right? To have or to be remains often, the choice, I think. And I guess you basically asking, what can bring people higher income in the future. And unfortunately, that question has a lot to do with the way we value certain professions. So, today you are more likely to earn higher income if you're in professions that deal with technology and that are technically and technologically specialized professions. You're less likely to earn high income when you're in care economy and so on, and in other jobs. So there is a question there about how we value professions. But if you just keep the current distribution for a moment constant and think, in this setting, what are the skills that will be needed, then I think it remains to be a combination of technical and basically soft and human skills. It's just that the concept of technical and soft skills evolves. So if you take an occupation of programmers, for example, people who write code in different ways, and you look at potential of automation with these tools, you will quickly get to a situation where you say, oh, it could all be automated. Programmers will no longer exist. But that is looking at tasks and requirements for programmers today. But the same programmers now will have to start using those tools differently, and the job of a programmer evolves. So that notion of being able to interact with the machine, including at that very close distance, which is what programmers and developers do, just evolves. It changes over time, and certain things you were doing when writing the code you will no longer do, but then you will do new things and new applications. So the notion of those technical skills in very technical jobs remains important, but also evolving and learning fast remains important. For other occupations, I think it also remains important to be able basically to interact with a machine and to obtain knowledge that is becoming much more widely available, also thanks to those tools. Even if you are in professional fields like a plumber, if you're able to quickly access information and manuals and so on, thanks to digital tools, that will put you at a comparative advantage in terms of how you can use tools and how productive you can be. So I think the question of being able to acquire that knowledge and interact with machines and apply the knowledge and the latest developments to basically human problems is an important ability. And the second one are those soft skills to be able to apply it to situations of working with other people and other humans and basically bridging that technological progress with what really matters in jobs today as well, especially higher paying jobs, which is coordinating with others and developing innovative products. But I pass over to Janine. She might have other advice for the young people.
No, I mean, I would agree with you. I mean, I do think the front-facing or people-facing type jobs are always going to exist, and we saw this during the pandemic. The so-called essential workers, that was basically 30% of the workforce in industrialized countries that, despite the pandemic, had to leave their house and perform these functions. These are jobs that are not going to be automated, but they're low-paying jobs. But that's a societal decision to make them low-paying jobs. We could be actually making them good jobs. So there's a lot that can be done from an institutional and societal perspective on what type of world of work we want. So that's one thing in hand. Now, as far as what should young people do, I think the people facing the care industries, the social skills are important. The knowing how to use the technology is important, and of course, knowing how to think. So critical thinking skills are really important, and we need to know that you can't take anything that AI spits out. You can't take it at face value, and you can only know how to take it at face value if you actually have some sort of knowledge of the field. So education is still important.
Mm. Pavel, if I understood you correctly, you made an interesting assumption that people would go into those jobs where you earn a lot of money. I read about an interesting study that a psychologist, prof at the University of Washington did. And she said, the most often given advice to young people is, you should follow what you like to do. You should follow your passion. But she says this is actually bad advice that often backfires, because people then easily follow stereotypes. So the stereotype is women, they want to help people, they want to make art, and male men, they do mechanical engineering, computer engineering, sciences, or they do sports. So if you ask about, or if you recommend that people should follow their passions, people may just, follow stereotypes, and they just, women may not even think about going into sciences or engineering just because it's not something that you're expected to do. So I found this interesting. I'm going to put maybe the paper later in the chat for people who are interested about that. Now, the question, how can workers from the informal economy leapfrog their skills to be capable for an AI labor market?
Okay, so one of the benefits of the technology is all of the tools that it gives, and particularly in education. So if you have a math problem that you're having trouble doing, you could actually ask ChatGPT and it can show you how to do the math problem. So it means that for people who don't have many resources, but they do have access to the computer, assuming they have some basic digital skills, they could somewhat train themselves. That is a bit of a stretch, and it's a little bit of an assumption to think that everyone's going to be able to do that, because you do need teachers to guide you in the training process. So I think there is a big use for AI, particularly in countries where there are shortages of teaching professionals or training professionals. They can be integrating that more into their training so that they can reach people more. This is also true just for digitalization in general. You can reach people more easily because of digitalization. So that's one thing that can be done. And so that's a benefit. That's certainly a benefit for the workers. For the informal economy workers, a lot of the people in informal economy in developing countries, they're food vendors, they're transport workers, they're domestic help workers. These are professions that ideally we want to be transitioning out of anyway. They're low value added, they're low pay professions. So to the extent that in general that we have broad-based policies to help people transition out of these jobs is a good thing. And I think AI can be a tool for that.
Okay. Janine, you mentioned the strike of the Writers Guild in the United States last year. It was a long standoff, 5 months. Can you perhaps maybe summarize what it was about and the outcome, and whether that could serve as an example for other unions, perhaps?
Right. So that was a really interesting strike, and it was a successful one. Like you said, it was longstanding. The unions were able to organize to have a collective bargaining agreement that gave them that the workers had to have consent if their digital image was going to be used. This is not just this is for the screen actors, and they would also be compensated. So, and then with the writers, there was limits on the use of AI in the writing process. This also hinged on the law in the U.S. that intellectual property is not under excuse me, that whatever the AI is producing is not under copyright. So that helped them in the negotiations. It's a very particular union. It's a very strong union that's existed for 100 years, if not more. And of course, it has a lot of name recognition, a lot of famous actors, and there was a lot of solidarity. So they really stuck together. They were able to move forward on the strike. It's going to be harder for other unions especially in countries with low unionization, because the unions aren't as strong. But it is an example, though, of how it's much quicker and much more flexible for a union to use collective bargaining. In this case, a strike, but eventually a collective bargaining agreement. Ideally, you would have collective bargaining without having to go to a strike, to have a collective bargaining agreement that leads to an outcome that's beneficial for the workers.
Okay, thank you. Back to the question from the audience. So going back to the emergence of specialized AI agents, I guess AI agents, I'm not sure, maybe meaning perhaps that you have software that's executing, not just giving prose or pictures as answers, but maybe actually executing. How do you see their impact on education? Would our kids just need to learn to be prompt masters instead of dwelling into a proper specialized education? You sort of touched on it, but
yeah, I don't think it's enough to just be a prompt master, because you have to know how to prompt. In order to know how to prompt, you need to know the subject a little bit.
Yeah.
So you do need the education, and education's not going away, and we certainly don't want it to go away. But the best approach is to be using the technology in the education, because if you try to block it anyway, the children are going to use it. So that's not a realistic option. So you want to be integrating it to as much as possible. But it's not just a matter of just learning how to prompt.
Yeah, maybe also on this, we had a discussion a little bit in our preparatory talks, but I think, nothing replaces sound knowledge of a field, of a certain field. Otherwise, it's a very sort of superficial knowledge. So, one can think about the typical comparison of Excel sheet or a calculator that will not replace the skill of counting. Of course, we no longer multiply by hand and so on. Most of that we'll do on the calculator, but the ability to make calculations remains crucial. And the same thing, I do a lot of data science work. And in that work, things constantly evolve. There are certain lines of codes I no longer have to write, or it doesn't take me that long. And you can imagine that evolving eventually to certain languages, maybe becoming sort of no-code programming for certain applications. But once you get into a technical field of any sort, you have to, I think, understand that field, and then so that you're able to move in that field with the progress of technologies that make that field evolve. And if you just know it by interacting with an agent and getting answers each time, then I think there's a very superficial understanding of that field that wouldn't be very good. Now, how to deal with that in terms of challenges of education and people actually wanting to get that curiosity to learn something properly is a different challenge that I think goes a little bit beyond our expertise. It's really a question of education, but I think a very big question for the future.
If you go to college or to university these days, the way things are being taught are pretty much the same they were taught 500 years ago. You have someone standing in front of a class or maybe in front of a screen now, and the person is giving a lecture. Do you see changes in the way things are being taught or should be taught? When the MOOCs came up, the massive online platforms, that was thought to revolutionize the education system, and I guess it brought about quite some changes. But what didn't happen is, the MOOCs, they don't have the branding. They don't have the branding of a famous university, and this branding is worth just, I think, an awful lot. So what is your take about where the education system should be going in the future?
Okay, I'm not an education expert. I'm a parent. I don't know if that helps. And I study the world of work. I don't think the MOOCs didn't work just because it didn't have the branding. I think it also didn't work because you do need that human contact in education. So, I mean, you can have some lectures, obviously, or virtual lectures, but you also do need the more interaction and the feedback with professors. So I think, yeah, you still need the human, and with the AI advances, there can be tools, you can reach more people, you could have economies of scale, but you do need still the human that kind of leads the mentoring and the teaching process. And so I think that I don't see going away.
Okay.
Or shouldn't be going away.
Pavel, any take?
I'm not an education expert and not even a parent, so I'm even less qualified to answer questions on this. And I don't think I want to be, inventing things, but maybe in the world of work, that's a different thing, because I think these tools have a massive potential to sort of democratize access and make it more available for people who want to reskill. But that means when you're already at the world of work, you would have to arrive there with a level of curiosity and ability to learn and absorb knowledge that comes from the education system. And I think that connection really matters, because you quickly realize, when you give the digital tools to people, the way they will apply them will very much depend on the level of overall education that they received so far. And that ability at the world of work will also be visible. So people who have been trained on acquiring new knowledge fast to absorb it, will make great use of those tools. But if you don't have our basic skills, if you don't have numerical skills, you're not going to, you're not going to benefit that much from these tools as someone with a sound education in numerical skills, who can just take their education to the next level on their own. So I think that connection remains very important. And of course, that goes back to the digital divide and the fact that there are many people around the world who won't even, be able to access those tools for the moment. And of course, the gap in skills is also very big when you look at some of the education surveys. Having numerical skills in a low-income country and high-income country, when you leave an education institution, you have very different level of skills. So you're starting from a different level, and then you start interacting with those tools there. I don't think we know today how far the tools can help you bridge that gap. Probably if you're, extremely good at it, you can bridge it on your own. But on average, what will that do? I think there's a good chance of just them boosting those who have already been high and not giving the same opportunities to people who don't have the same starting point.
Okay. If you were able to look into your crystal ball, Janine and Pavel, so I don't know whether you want to answer that. On which side of the debate would you place yourself? I said at the very beginning, some people think, technology is going to bring changes, but at the end it's going to be good, if you look down the road. But then there's the other camp which says this time it's going to be different, because technology is now just so advanced, and all the new jobs are also going to be taken over by new technology. So which side on the debate are you on?
Okay, so I can speak first. So I am on the side that it's not a jobs apocalypse. All the jobs aren't going to disappear. It's not going to be a future without work. There's still work that's going to be done. That said, we are bringing in this technology into a world of work where there's already a lot of problems in labor markets and the world of work across the world, and particularly in the global south, where you have labor surplus and you have very growing populations. So there you already have a lot of people who don't have enough jobs, and this will add to those pressures, particularly if the technology is integrated. So I don't not no to the jobs apocalypse, but it's not necessarily a rosy story, because it's really going to matter also on how most people will still be affected by the technology, and some, well, not some, but a lot of people will still be affected by the technology, just like we're affected by technology in our daily life. And how that technology affects us is very much a policy decision, which is why we've advocated for the need for social dialogue, for technology's integration at the workplace, the need for some sort of basic protection of rights. And yeah, just more thinking about these issues, more of a proactive approach to technology's integration rather than just being reactive.
Okay, thanks very much, Janine. Pavel?
Well, I'm myself. I mean, I agree with everything Janine said, but basically, I'm on the side of what I see from my own data and from other studies, and that is a little bit reinforcing the picture that Janine was talking about. I showed you some of the plots from Latin America when we look at jobs exposed to automation, and you can see these are very much formal jobs, higher income jobs, disproportionately held by women. So if you're thinking about potentially these jobs being exposed to the risk of automation, you have that on the one hand, and on the other hand, you have the risk that the new jobs that emerge do not have to have the same qualities. They don't have to be formal. They don't have to have proper job contracts. I think this kind of technology, and that's something we wrote about in our paper, bigger risk than eliminating jobs is the erosion of the quality of jobs. And you can see this being a temptation. That's why policies really matter, because you can read about jobs of editors, jobs of writers who have been told, well, you no longer need to have a proper contract. Maybe now you can just be a consultant and review what AI has produced. So rather than having like an efficiency or productivity gain translating into maybe fewer but still proper jobs, what you could see is basically fragmentation into maybe the same number of jobs, maybe fewer, but jobs of worse quality. So I think that notion of incentives, policy incentives for that transition to result in good jobs is really important, as much as understanding how many jobs will be affected. But even if you have jobs being reduced, those that remain because of productivity effect, I think it would be really important to focus on policies that encourage that these jobs are actually good and that you don't have that erosion in place. And that's really my biggest worry of this transition.
Okay, thanks a lot. I think we're coming to a close of today's talk and discussion. So a big thank you, big applause, Janine and Pavel, and we're looking forward to your future papers coming out from the International Labour Organization. Let me tell you who is next on the program. So one of the people that we are going to have on AI for Good is Darren Acemoglu. He is a star economist from MIT. And he and his colleague, Simon Johnson, wrote a book called Power and Prosperity, which came out a year ago. I've read it. I recommend it. They have the thesis that the technological advancement don't automatically lead to the betterment of humankind. You really have to fight for it, because otherwise the technology is just limited to a very narrow elite. And they are pretty critical with respect to AI, in particular with respect to the impact of AI on the job market and on democracy. So this is going to be on our platform on Wednesday, the 19th of June. So we'll invite you to that. And then we have a whole list of other speakers that you will be interested in listening to. So thanks a lot. And we continue if you can stay on the neural network, if there are still questions coming in, you can also respond on the neural network. So thanks a lot, and handing back to our avatar. Okay.
Thanks for inviting
Bye-bye.
me.
Yeah.
Thank you for participating in today's AI for Good session. We hope you've learned something new, innovative, and engaging in today's event. We now encourage you to continue the conversation on the live video wall in the neural network. Here you can ask questions, like and comment, share links, complete the poll, connect with interesting profiles, or speak one-on-one using the chat and video function. We invite you to explore the lobby, try the smart matching quiz, visit the virtual exhibits, poster boards, the eShop, and build your personalized AI for Good program. Let's shape the future of AI for Good.
The AI for Good Global Summit, convened by ITU, recognizes the joint responsibility of governments, the private sector, United Nations agencies, academia, and others to ensure AI reaches its full potential while preventing and mitigating harms.
And it's a moment that calls for action. And today I'm calling on each of you to use this summit to help the world to better understand what kinds of regulations, what kinds of guardrails we need to put in place right now. So together, let's make it innovative, let's make it safe, and let's make it responsible for all. Thank you very much.